You already know this, but we, over this last month or so, have been walking through a series on First Peter. And at the heart of First Peter, today we're going to be in First Peter 3, at the heart of the very first chapter and a half of First Peter is a single idea that Peter wants to hit you over the head with. That he wants every one of us, that we make it through these first chapter and a half, to walk away with this single idea, and it's this, that when I've given my life to Christ, when I have submitted my life to Him, when I start following Him, that I am a child of God. That no longer am I defined by what I've done, by what I've said, but I'm defined by what He's done and what He's said. And so, here's what I'd love for you to do. Because for Peter, if we miss this, we miss everything that he's about to say for us. So I want to do something. I want to introduce us into something that we've been doing at the Calvary campus the last couple of weeks. And I'll be honest, it's just meant a whole lot to me. So if you're able, I'd love for you to stand. Come on. And I'd love for you to find a partner. Just find somebody, whether they know you or not. You got your partner? Come on, I'll give you a second. All right, so here's what I want you to do. You ready? Just follow the leader, okay? I want one of you to look at the other and say, I am a child of God. Amen. Now, the other one, look back at the other one and say, I am one too. Nice. All right, you ready? Number 2. Say, this is not my home. And you look back at him and say, that's not my home either. All right, and then, God has something better for you. And go, well, God has something better for me too. And then the last one, you ready? This is why. Because I'm a child of God. That's right, and say it back. Yeah, I'm a child of God. All right, you can be seated. Okay. So I don't want you to miss this, and the reason why we do this is because Peter wants to hit you over the head with it, because this idea, this is identity. This, at the heart of his entire chapter and a half, is what he needs you to understand about who you are the moment that you've given your life to him. That when you give him your life, he takes your life and he gives you something that's far better than anything that you've ever had in your life, a new identity. And he looks to you and he looks to me and says, this is who you are. I'm married, so I'm a husband, but I'm also a dad, and so I've got 2 kids. I have a 3.5-year-old daughter, her name's Harper, and then a 1.5-year-old son, his name is Hudson. And so my daughter, my 3.5-year-old daughter, Harper, she's completely and officially into the Y stage. Anybody ever had a Y stage kid? Yeah. And so anytime that Janessa or I say or ask her to do pretty much anything, she says what? Why? So we'll go, hey, Harper, it's time, we're about to leave, it's time to get your shoes on. And so what does she say? Why? So Harper, that food hit the floor. That means you don't eat it anymore. And so what does she say? Why? And I'm just like, what? I answer the way you've answered. Because. Sometimes there's even a reason attached to it, because I try to rationalize with my 3.5-year-old, because it makes sense. You need your shoes on to go outside. Or because it's not good to eat food off the floor. And so after I give her this unbelievably smart, well thought out explanation, what does she say? Why? And I'm like, because I said so. You know this because you've walked through it, because everyone in here knows you cannot rationalize with a toddler tyrant. But that's how I try to handle it. But my wife, Janessa, she's so smart. She's an expert at these things. You see, I try to explain, but Janessa, she shifts into identity every time. So smart. And so when Harper starts to ask why, she doesn't just say because or because I said so. She goes deeper. She goes bigger. This is so good. This is so foundational. She says, because this is how we do things in this family. Let me highlight 2 things about this and why we say this in our family. Because number 1, that Harper, you're in this family. Nothing you do can change that. Not your obedience, not your words, not your own will. Maybe you want to get out of this family, but you don't have a choice. And you're in this family. Why? Because you're our daughter, whether you want to be or not. But since you're here, since you're a part of this family, number 2, There is a way that we do things here. That when we go outside to leave, we put our shoes on. That despite what some people may think, we don't eat food off the floor. Because there's a way that we do things. And so Peter looks to you, and he looks to me, and he looks to every one of us. He says, hey, look, when you know Jesus, when you've given your life to him, and he's given you that new identity, you are part of his family now. But there's a certain way that we do things here. And so last week, Mike kind of kicked us off on what that begins to look like. And on the second half of chapter 2, Peter really gives us 2 commands. He says, since you're in this family, there's a way that we do things. Let me give you those 2. Then 1 Peter 2:11, he says, beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles, that's identity, to abstain from the passions of the flesh. I want you to hold off from all those things that you want to do, from all the things that you wish you could go do, and you're like, man, my life would be better if. He says, I want you to hold off from those. It's like, but I love it, and I'm so passionate about it. He's like, yeah, but hold off from those. Which wage war against your soul? It's number 1. But then he gives us a second one. Verse 12, he says, keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable. He says, the world, when you go to work, when you go to the pool, when your friends see you out and about in the community, keep your conduct among them honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds. Now, this is great, isn't it? It's like, yeah, that's what we should do. Because when we live our lives according to Christ, we end up being a light for Christ, right? But here's the question. The question I kind of want you to think about just for a second is, that's great and all, but what's the best way to do this? Because depending on who you are, we all kind of have a different idea of what the best way to walk this out is. Now, before you answer that question of what's the best way to walk this out, I mean, think about, if you can remember, the 2 people groups, very different, who Peter is talking to in 1 Peter chapter 2. He starts off by highlighting his Jewish Christian audience who are under the thumb of Rome. And then he moves on, the bottom half of the chapter, and he begins to speak to slaves to their masters. So you have a Jewish audience who lives far from home under an oppressive power, and then you have slaves in relationship to their masters. Do you know what neither one of these groups has? It's a voice. See, they didn't get to vote. They didn't get to file a complaint. They didn't get to sit at the panel and speak their minds or post a reel about injustice. They were under authority, and they were stuck under that authority there. And so what does Peter do? He doesn't tell them to go rebel. He doesn't tell them to organize and let's fight the system. He doesn't say, just wait till your moment and then you can make that post and then you can let them have it. No, what does Peter say? Because Peter gives a command that many of us, when we've read, we've tried to push away. And some of us have even ignored. And here's what he says. He says, I want you to submit. To submit? He says, yeah, to governing authorities, to unjust masters, to people who have a power over you who are not wielding it well. Now, let's be honest. That, like me, many of you, when you've read this, when we walked through these passages the last couple of weeks, it didn't quite sit well with you. Because everything in us wants to say, but God, Jesus, Peter, this is not fair. And it's not. Because Peter's talking to a people who've been overlooked. They've been talked over. They've been controlled. They've been dismissed. They've been mistreated. They've been wounded by an authority that was meant to protect them, but ultimately dismissed them. And so when Peter says submit, when we hear that word, it doesn't sound holy, does it? It almost sounds like compromise, like defeat, like we're letting somebody else win when they haven't deserved to. And if you've ever been in that situation where you had no voice, you know that helpless feeling. When you sit in the meeting, your ideas are ignored, and you come home and the words are twisted, and you speak the truth, and when that person says, I don't believe you, and you try to do what's right, and it ultimately backfires. And Peter says, I want you to submit. But here's what he ultimately says, is that submission is not a surrender to people. Don't miss this. It's a surrender to who? To God. Because, friends, submission, biblically, no matter where you look at it in the Bible, is not weakness, it's not silence, and it's not spiritual death. Because submission, biblically, is always power. It's a decision, it's a choice, it's an action, but it's always under control. And it's always rooted in the cross. I mean, just look how Peter ends chapter 2. He says these incredible verses. He says, "For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God." What? He keeps going. "For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his footsteps." And then Peter gives us this incredible picture of Jesus. He says in the next verse, he says, "He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly." Like, let this sink in for a second. It's the amazing idea that Jesus had a voice and he chose not to use it. That he had the right above anyone and everyone else in all the world to speak up, and he chose to stay silent. He had the power to retaliate, and he always chose restraint. That he, in that fateful morning as he's hanged on that cross, could have called down legions of angels. And instead, he trusted the Father. Why? Because that's what submission looks like. Not weakness, not silence, but a willing, purposeful surrender to God's plan. Because we trust God more than ourselves. And listen, this is where Peter shocks us. He says this is what you've been called to. To pain, to injustice, to a broken and unfair system? No, not exactly. But to look like Jesus. Because that's what changes people. Not louder opinions, not louder arguments, but lives that are so full of grace and so exemplify who and what Jesus was about, that we can't help but wonder and to question when the world looks upon us and go, what kind of love is that? See, that's why Peter says submit. Not because the world deserves it, not because your spouse deserves it, but because of what Jesus did. And so now, as we look at 1 Peter 3, he begins to transition and moves us into the most personal, difficult, emotionally loaded places that submission ever shows up, our marriages. And here's what he says. In 1 Peter 3:1, he says, "Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands." Now, before we get too defensive or dismissive of this phrase, be subject, let's just remind ourselves that this is not a burden that Peter is putting on us, but it's God's original design that he's calling us back to. So in Genesis 2:18, when God created Adam, he says, "Then the Lord God said, it is not good that the man should be alone." Some of you can say amen to that. And you're like, man, he wouldn't make it. "But I will make him a helper fit for him." Now, the truth is, for a lot of us in this room, we don't like this word, do we? Because the truth is, I think when we first read it, it sounds dismissive. It feels secondary. Like God was just in the garden, like there was some kind of huddle between the Trinity, and they're like, gosh, what do we do? He's looking a little bored there. He's not kind of hanging out with the animals anymore. I mean, the NFL doesn't start for a couple thousand years. Like, well, we got to get him something. So let's make him a helper. See, we think secondary. We think dismissive. At worst, I think we think servant. You know what I think we often think? Hamburger helper. Like, you're not even the meat. You're just the mac. Like, you're an addition to. You're not the actual purpose. But the truth is, helper was never secondary. It was always necessary. See, when Moses writes Genesis 2, God says, "Then the Lord God said, it is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him the word there for helper is actually Ezer. Ezer shows up in the Old Testament 21 times. Twice, it's specifically about Eve calling her a helper. 3 times, it's in regards to the nation of Israel calling for help as they're being besieged. 15 of the other 16 times, Ezer references God himself being an aid and a helper to those who call on him. God is not secondary. And ladies, neither are you as a helper. Eve was not optional. She was essential. And so Peter says, wives, likewise, and according to the design that God has given you, be subject to your own husbands. Because remember, biblical submission isn't subservience, it's trust. It's not forced, it's freely chosen. It's what God has called you to. And it's part of who God has called you to be, which makes sense when you think of it in terms of identity. That you are a child of God, that this is not your home, and that God has something better for you, which makes this so unbelievably practical, especially in the context of Peter's context. That the women that he is writing to simply don't have rights. That in Roman households, if the husband didn't follow Christ, the wife had zero spiritual influence. No voice, no authority, no vote. And so what does Peter tell them? He didn't say fight for control. He says live in a way in which invites your husbands to take over, to lead, and to love you well. Not by preaching at him, but by honoring God's design for you. Not out of fear, but out of faith. That God can use our works and your words and your actions to make a difference that will resound for generations. Friends, that's why submission is not weak, it's always strategic. Because it's saying, God, I trust you to do more with my obedience than I could ever do with my own arguments. And Peter doubles down on this and he says, look, even your life can be a sermon. Look at what he says. He says, so that even if some do not obey the word, he's talking about husbands, that they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. And when they see respectful and pure conduct, your respectful and pure conduct preaches louder than any amount of words ever could. This doesn't mean that words are bad. It just means they need more. Because friends, if your words say Jesus is Lord, but your attitude says that you're the boss, if your lips say grace, but the tone in which you say it is sharp and impactful, if your theology is strong, but your posture is cold, then friends, you're preaching a different gospel with your actions, with your words. Because friends, we know this, but you can't control anyone into Christ likeness. And you can't nag someone into transformation. But you can live in a way in which your actions and your words and the choices that you make and the decisions that you enact ultimately preach God and preach Jesus and preach the gospel far more than anything you could ever say ever could. So here's the question. If that's true, if my life is what preaches, then what kind of life is God calling me to live? What kind of character is he asking me to have? Ladies, what character is he asking you to have and to enact and to make the centerpiece of who you are so that other people don't even have to hear you speak and they know that some kind of love and some kind of transformation and the way that she treats her husband is preaching? And I want to know more about that because Peter's answer might surprise you because it's not flashy, it's not loud, and it's not driven by appearances. In fact, he moves from behavior to heart. Look at what he says in verse 3 and 4. He says, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing that you wear. But let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. Now, let me just go ahead and tell you what he's not saying. He's not saying that you just simply don't need to ever care about what you look like. Like, it's not saying that when you care about what your hair looks like, the jewelry that you wear, the dresses you wear, what you put on, that it's sinful to do so. It's not. If you spent 20 or 30 minutes or an hour, whatever it was for you to get ready today, like, he's not saying that you're wrong. This is not a ban on beauty. It's a call to prioritize our beauty. Because here's what you know. Anyone in here over the age of about 30, you've looked in the mirror recently and you're like, I just don't have it together like I used to. That wrinkle is there. Where did that come from? We're like, gosh, I used to be. No, because Peter knows what you know is that external beauty fades. But the beauty of your soul, that's what lasts. Now don't miss this. The word that Peter uses here for adorning is the word cosmos. It literally means cosmos or world. What it means is order or arrangement. So Peter isn't just talking about accessories and making sure that you don't wear the right or wrong things. He's asking you a question. He's saying, look, what's the arrangement of your life? Are you building everything that you look like always on what's on the outside, or are you focused on what's on the inside? Are you building a world that's built on appearance, or are you building your life and your world on substance? Like, is your energy going towards what is seen, what you wear, what you don't wear, or what is unseen and what ultimately God values and he sees? And then Peter keeps going on. He highlights two things that we should value because that's what he values. Here's what he says. He says, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty, because everything on the outside eventually fades, but there's an imperishable beauty that does not. And he highlights two things. He says, in a gentle and quiet spirit. Now, at first glance, you're probably like me, and you're like, those don't seem that great. I kind of want more than that. But I love this. The word here for gentle is a word that's specifically used about wild horses that have been tamed. Like, I love that. Because it's strength under control. It's the idea that you're someone who has all the power and all the control, and you choose to relinquish some of it. It's someone who doesn't fly off the handle, someone who can take a hit without throwing one back. It's someone whose strength comes from trust in the Lord, not the trust in themselves and their own value and their own volume and their own dominance. And then this word quiet, it doesn't mean that you never talk. It means there's a settled spirit in your spirit, that you're not frantic, that you're not chasing affirmation, but you're anchored in who God is. And Peter says these two things. This is what God sees as precious. Not the world's highlight reel, but the hidden heart. Not your new style, but this old strength. When I was in North Carolina, there was a lady that I met. She was well into her 80s. And she had been married for over 50 years. And she had been a stay-at-home mom for at least 30 of those. What I loved about her was she was one of those people who had this immense wisdom. That people would line up at her door, call her up at tons of hours of the night. And she'd never led a Bible study. Like, she never wrote a book. She never had a platform, but people were constantly seeking her wisdom and her advice out. A few years ago, this lady eventually passed away. And I'll never forget standing at her funeral, and I was blown away. Like, I knew that people in our church would show up. That was expected. But I didn't expect our whole city to show up. I'll never forget as friends, as family, as addicts, as abusers, as tatted up bikers with rough presents, not just pasts, showed up. All taking the stage, mic in hand, over and over again, and they said the same thing over and over again. They called her Grandma. She said, Grandma didn't just tell us about Jesus. She looked like Jesus. They talked about how every morning she would wake up and she would pray systematically through the entire family and her friends, praying for God to bless them and to bring glory to himself through them. How she kept a prayer journal that covered the entire community. How her Bible was duct taped, how it was falling apart, the pages were coming out, verses underlined. There were tear stains on the pages and words after words underlined and circled in red ink. And they talked about how when they felt alone, when they felt unseen, when they felt uncared for, unheard, and unnoticed, how she noticed them. And she always had a seat at the table open for them, even when no one noticed her. And Peter says that's what real beauty looks like. That's the beauty that lasts. I love this. And Peter adds, he said, ladies, when you do this, you are not alone, but you join the strongest women in the faith. Look at what he says. He says, for this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn, how they used to arrange, how they used to order themselves by submitting to their own husbands. As Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you are children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Because ladies, when you're overspoken, when you go unheard, when you don't get represented, and you still choose faithfulness, and you're not fading into the background, but you're stepping into the lineage of the fiercest women of our faith. Women whose strength wasn't loud, but it was lasting, whose legacy was not built on a stage or built on a spotlight, but in secret places where only God saw, and he saw the momentum, he saw the change, and he saw the action, and he saw the faithfulness that would ultimately change a generation. And Peter says, look, when you do this, ladies, when you take that step, when you don't speak up about it, he says you're not just surviving, even though it feels like it, even though right now it feels like you're not heard and you're uncared for, that you're not just surviving, you're preaching the gospel with your life. He says, look, you can make the biggest differences, not simply by the words that you say, but the way that you treat people, by the words that you don't say, of how you show up every single day and create a platform and create a scenario and create an environment for your children to flourish, of how you create a platform for your husbands to flourish, how you're constantly being poured into but also pouring out. And Peter says, look, I know it feels like you're surviving. I know it feels like you're barely making it, but you're not, you're thriving. Like, this is what I've called you to, because you are being a light for the world because you're preaching the gospel when people just simply look at your lives and they go, what kind of marriage could be that? What kind of woman could do that, who has all this power and can make all this difference, have all this life, and yet she's holding it back? Why? Because that's what God's called you to do. He says, look, you're preaching the gospel with your life. Because this kind of godly, faith-filled submission doesn't simply happen in a vacuum. And it's also not a one-sided calling. And it's not a license for passivity, husbands, for us either. In fact, if at this point, already pretty far in, if you're like, man, this has been a lot on ladies, Ben. Here's what Peter says about guys. He says, likewise, he says everything I just said to you, ladies, men, likewise. Husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way. Now, this phrase, understanding way, literally means according to knowledge, which means you should know, husbands, we should know our wives. We should study her. We should understand her. We should have all this information as we're getting to know her over and over again, all throughout our lives. When Janessa and I were dating, I was in seminary and she was in her undergrad. I was taking basically dual enrollment at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and Janessa University. Every time that we would go out to get Sonic drinks, I had a list of what her orders were. That whenever we would go to Thornton's, it was all the rage back then, we would go in there and I had a list of all of her favorite candies, her favorite restaurants, her favorite drink, whatever it was. I was making an ongoing list, and I would just have it I'd be like, oh, she's having a bad day? Here's where you got it. Here, I got it for you. You know why I did that? Because I needed all the help I could get. And one time, we would watch movies together from time to time, and I found out her favorite movies or favorite books were The Lord of the Rings. And I'll be honest, I was more of a Star Wars guy. There was a week where I did a deep dive on the genealogy and the history of all of The Lord of the Rings, and I was like, hey, I would just try to come up with all my knowledge and be like, did you know Frodo's real strength wasn't the ring? It was his resilience. And she's like, no, it wasn't. What are you talking about? What's wrong with you? But I studied, I worked hard, and I was getting to know her. In the last week, we were going to the drive-thru at Chick-fil-A, and I was in a hurry, and as we're going through there, they're like, hey, what do you want in your order? And I was like, I know Harper's, I know Hudson's, I know mine. I'm like, do you get the sandwich or the nuggets? Oh, God, which drink is it? And she kind of looked at me and was like, what happened? You used to know, Can I tell you what happened? Because the truth is, it's for me, but it's also for so many of us guys, is that somewhere along the way, I stopped studying. That oftentimes, guys, we get comfortable. We get complacent with where we are and with who we have, and we believe that even though we know she's changing, even though we know that we're changing, even though we know the situation that God has us is different than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 40 years ago, we act as if she's still exactly the same. And this is exactly what Peter is warning us against. He says, I want you to live with your wives in an understanding way, according to knowledge, which is not a one-time download. That's not, I figured her out back when we were dating, and now I'm good for life. No. It's an ongoing pursuit, a daily investment. It means paying attention to what she's carrying, what she's walking through, what she's going through, because it matters, and you are called to actually care for her soul. But gentlemen, God's called us to ask better questions. Not to fix her, not to even impress her, but because you love her, because she's worth knowing over and over again. He says, I want you to study her. But guys, this is why we need to prioritize knowing our wives on purpose, which means you need to know what encourages her, like knowing what wounds her, knowing what brings her joy in different situations, when she needs a break, when she needs a moment of rest, and what she loves to do. We need to become students of her. And then Peter adds a line. And he adds this line. He says, likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel. Now, when he says weaker vessel, let me tell you what he's not saying. He is not insulting women, and he's not saying that you're a lesser person. It doesn't mean spiritually inferior or even intellectually behind. Like the actual word here literally means that the phrase points primarily to physical vulnerability and societal position. I mean, think about it. In the first century, the women that he's writing to were far more vulnerable legally, economically, and socially. I mean, in a moment, a man could dismiss his wife and she would have no money, no power, no vote, no authority, and could really do nothing about it. And so when Peter says weaker vessel, he's not insulting women. He's indicting the system in which they're in. And he says, I want you to do the opposite. I'm flipping the script. He says, I want you to honor her. I want you to value her. Don't treat her like that little, that plastic Tupperware, guys, that you've had in your, there for the last 20 years, and you've been, putting food it's stained now, it's red, and you don't know how to get that color out, and you microwaved it, it says don't microwave it, but you have, and it smells weird, but you're like, that's my Tupperware. He says, don't treat her like that. Do you know that, guys, we can be honest here, right? You know that weird dish that's like sitting on top of something that's far out of the way of everything that could break it? That fine china that you only bring out like kind of during Thanksgiving or Christmas because it's so valuable and somewhere along the way it meant a whole lot to somebody? He says, I want you to treat her like that fine piece of china. I want you to take care of her. I want you to value her. I want you to value her like the daughter of God that she actually is, because she's not disposable. She's not replaceable. There's only one of her. And she is precious in God's sight. And I love what Peter says here. He goes, here's why. You ready? Guys, this should take us back. He adds this. He says, women as a weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Do you know what he's saying here? He says, guys, look, if you dishonor your wife, it will disrupt your relationship with God. That's terrifying. Every summer when we were in North Carolina, I would go to summer camp, and it was in the mountains. And so Janessa would stay at home with the kids, and I would go take a whole bunch of kids to summer camp. And I would kind of do that my husbandly duty, and I would always at night FaceTime, it was like 3 times throughout the week, and try to FaceTime with Janessa. And so the service there was always so bad, and I would kind of do that like where you look like you're doing like kind of gymnastics, and you're like, because she would constantly freeze and we'd constantly lose connection. I got so frustrated one time that I walked to the director of the camp, and I was like, look, I can't even FaceTime my wife. What's wrong with this camp? And I'll never forget, he just kind of laughed for a second. And he puts his arm around me, walks me out of his office, and he points to this 5,000-foot mountain. And he goes, Ben, that might be the problem with your connection. Now, guys, for some of us, then in the last little while, you've wondered, what's wrong with this connection that I have with God? And what Peter's ultimately saying is that for some of us, it's the way that we're treating, the way that we're talking about, the actions that we do against our wives. It's the way that we treat her that is ultimately getting in the way of our relationship with him. He says, here, Peter is calling men to be humble. He says, honoring leadership, not because we've earned it, but because we've been given grace. And look at the last line he says here. He says, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life. See, gentlemen, she is not beneath you. She is beside you. She is not your assistant. She is co-heirs with you. God doesn't give you more grace than he gives her, and we lead not from dominance, but from dignity. So, husbands, if you're here, listen to me clearly. Your greatest act of leadership is not control, it's Christ-like care. You want to make the greatest difference in your community? You love her like Christ would love the church. You want people to see your life and to hear your words and to paint a beautiful, detailed picture of what Jesus would do if he was in your situation. You love her like the daughter of Christ that she actually is. But here's the hard part. This is unbelievably hard, isn't it? That the role and the calling that God has put on your lives, ladies, that the demands that he has put on you and us, husbands, submission, understanding, honor, these are not natural, they are supernatural things. And yet this is where the gospel moves from the pages of the Bible to your actual marriage. And this is where it stops becoming a theory that we hold to, but a testimony that we declare for the world to see. Because, friends, how you treat your spouse will be the loudest gospel that you ever preach. So here's the question. If that's true, will you surrender your understanding and your viewpoint or the world's viewpoint of what marriage is? Will you trust his design even if you wouldn't have drawn it up this way? Will you live your identity out, not just in the church, not just on Sundays, not just when the Bible is open, but in your marriages wherever you go? Because look, your home is where the gospel will either die or lives in integrity. People will look to your marriages, they will look to your home, they will look to your children, and that will preach Christ far more than when you drive down the road and you say hi, or when you meet somebody for coffee. Which means that we have a sacred opportunity to represent Jesus in our marriages, to represent him in our relationships, with how we treat our spouses, to be a light on the hill in a world that is drowning in darkness. That you have the ability to push back the gates of hell, not with a protest or even a post, but with love, humility, honor, and grace. Think about that. That when a husband honors his wife like Christ loves the church, when a wife submits out of strength and confidence, not in him, but in God, when a couple forgives quickly, joyfully, serves, and sacrifices daily, we, you, she, he becomes a light to the world. And the world will see something different. Your kids will see something real. Your friends will see something holy. You don't need a stage to preach from. You don't need a title to lead. You just need a heart that's surrendered to Jesus and says, Lord, I want to reflect you where I am as you are. Because if Jesus changed the world through his submission, he might change the world through your submission. Because what happens if we lived this out? What happens if we begin to use our postures to preach Christ? What happens if husbands, we begin to lead not with pride, but with honor and humility? What if we as single men and women began to view relationships not as a means of self-fulfillment, but as a platform for gospel proclamation? Do you know what will happen? You and I and we will, as a church, begin to watch marriages get healed, walls get torn down, cycles get broken, wounds be healed, and generations changed. That when we live this out, our home stops being battlegrounds and starts becoming beacons for what God can do and will do and wants to do in your life when you lay it down at the foot of the cross. And so today, if you're here wondering, God, do you even see what I'm doing? Do you care about what's going on? Do you hear what I'm crying out? Do you feel and do you see the wounds that I'm walking through? Everyone in here know that Jesus sees you. That the world may not listen, the system may be broken, your spouse may not understand, but look, your Savior does. And how do we know this? Because he lived it first. If Jesus conquered death through his submission, what might he conquer in your life through your submission? What healing might he begin? What testimony might be born? What person might come to Christ just by watching you live your life for Christ? Because how you treat your spouse is one of the greatest ways you will ever preach Christ. And if Jesus can change the world through a cross, he can change your home through his Spirit.